First off, right up front, I apologize for the length of this video, but there was no way I could do justice to this topic in under 20 or 30 minutes. This, in my opinion, is my best work so far, if I may be so bold as to brag. If you can, please try and watch the whole thing. You don't have to watch it all in one sitting, but I'd really appreciate your feedback in the comments below. So I want to talk about this thing that is called implicit bias, what it means, how it's measured, and how it's measured by this other thing called the Implicit Association Test, and a brief historical survey to show how this scientific construct turned into the cultural juggernaut it is today. So I need to start off with a disclaimer. As I was researching this topic, I was struggling with the literature. I could not get a bird's eye view of this topic. It kept eluding me. I kept seeing, or I thought I was seeing, a shift taking place within the literature. And it wasn't just your normal ad hoc revisions. It was definitional and or operational. And I kept seeing different definitions offered of what implicit bias meant, which I knew, or I know enough of to know, that offering different definitions will change how you measure something, which will produce radically different results. And it wasn't until I finally stumbled across something that kind of made it all make sense. The first one, which I'll reveal right now, is that there is considerable disagreement amongst social psychologists over what exactly implicit bias is, which runs completely contrary to the way in which this concept has been presented to the public for the past 20 plus years. And there is also considerable disagreement over the scientific reliability and validity of the implicit association test as a psychometric tool that is used supposedly to objectively capture and measure implicit bias. The second thing, which finally made my cognitive dissonance disappear, was something that I was already familiar with, but I had completely spaced it out. And I'll reveal exactly what that is later in the video. In addition, I came across a really good paper on the evolution of implicit bias, which broke this concept up into two distinct phases of its development. And once I got that, everything kind of fell into place. So first, I'm going to give a tentative working definition for now of what implicit bias is. And I'm choosing that word tentative on purpose because, like I said, there's two distinct different phases to this construct. So implicit bias in the original literature, phase one, goes by many names. Sometimes you'll see it as implicit bias, hidden bias, unconscious bias, implicit attitude, implicit stereotypes, unconscious stereotypes, or unconscious cognition. And what this concept is referring to is this idea that we all carry within us, within our minds, certain hidden or implicit biases that we are not consciously aware of possessing. And according to certain social psychologists, if left unchecked, these hidden biases produce in the aggregate negative social outcomes. And to give you an even better understanding of what implicit bias is, I'll turn to the co-creators of the Implicit Association Test, Dr. Anthony Greenwald and Dr. Mahjarin Banaji, to explain from their 2013 book, Blind Spot. This book focuses on another type of blind spot, one that contains a large set of biases and keeps them hidden. They are, for lack of a better term, bits of knowledge about social groups. These bits of knowledge are stored in our brains because we encounter them so frequently in our cultural environments. Once lodged in our minds, hidden biases can influence our behavior towards members of particular social groups, but we remain oblivious to their influence. As you can see, what Drs. Banaji and Greenwald are referring to is this notion that we all carry within us certain hidden biases buried in our unconscious minds that we are not aware of and, unbeknownst to us, bubble to the surface and subtly influence our behavior when dealing with people who are outside of our familiar social groups. That is, these hidden biases influence our actions, our decisions, and how we interact with other people and how we respond to groups external to our own. Basically, what the concept of implicit bias is saying is that as human beings, we unknowingly harbor unconscious biases against groups of people dissimilar to our own, and that these hidden prejudices can take any form from gender bias to sexual orientation bias, from disability bias to racial bias. And the most shocking part about these biases, the most counterintuitive thing about this concept, is the claim that these biases, according to these two social psychologists, are outside of our own control due to the fact that we are not even consciously aware of even possessing them. Let me just reiterate that. The most shocking part is that these attitudes, prejudices, biases, and stereotypes that are held implicitly, that is, without our conscious awareness, may actually be things that we explicitly would not endorse upon conscious self-reflection. In other words, we may have an internal implicit bias we are not even aware of, despite our explicit beliefs. So that's a tentative definition for now of what implicit bias is, which brings us to the Implicit Association Test, the IAT, upon which this theory is supposedly confirmed. And for this, I turn to Dr. Banerjee herself to explain.
The Implicit Association Test, it has been around for about 15 years, and it has become a quite popular measure that many psychologists are using in their research. Psychology has its origins in Germany. German psychologists, for the very first time, began to measure the mind, and that was in the late 1800s. Okay. The way they did that is by asking people questions. They would say, tell me, how does this color look to you? Describe the red here. They had people introspect. They had people reflect on a prior episode and report back, what is their memory? What is their perception? How do they reason about it using language? For 100 years, that's how psychologists have largely measured the contents of what's in the mind, the mechanisms by which the mind works. But in the last, I would say, 30 years or so, there's been a slow shift towards trying to find better measures, sometimes measures that do not ask the person to say anything, but instead to respond very quickly or to do something by putting two things together. And these new measures we'll call indirect measures of cognition. We will not ask you, how do you feel about something? We will say to you, I'll flash a word on a screen and you have to tell me very quickly whether this word, second word, is a word or not a word. And now we can measure and see that the first word that you saw influences how you respond to the second word.
So going off what Dr. Banerjee said, the IAT was designed on purpose as an indirect test to prevent access to our thinking, conscious mind, to block access to self-reflection and or introspection in an attempt to get a better understanding of what is going on inside the mind. And the reason why this test was developed was because sometimes direct methods of observation fail to give us a true picture of the internal content of the mind. And this can be because of social pressure, social taboos, and or political correctness that can inhibit our true responses from coming to the surface. So to get around this normative pressure and to get a better grasp of the inner reality of our unconscious mind, the IAT was designed to not only bypass that filter, but to also uncover those hidden attitudes and beliefs that may reside in our unconsciousness. And it's these biases, according to Dr. Banerjee and her colleagues, that can unknowingly affect our behavior and, if left unchecked, lead to discriminatory behavior, which, as stated earlier, can accumulate into harmful effects upon society. Now, this, of course, should raise some obvious questions, such as, how does the Implicit Association Test actually work? How does it measure the unconscious mind? And if it can do this, how does it measure for unconscious bias? To answer these questions, I'll turn once again to Dr. Banerjee.
So you can now take this test. It's called the Implicit Association Test. And it simply measures how fast can you put black and good together compared to how fast you can put white and good together. And it takes the difference in the time and the number of mistakes you make when you do this test as a rough indicator of that idea in your mind and what attitude you have towards it. So the Implicit Association Test simply measures the strength of association between an attribute such as good and bad, tall and short, strong and weak, and many groups that we can imagine, elderly and young, male and female, black and white, gay and straight, whatever it is you're interested in. That's what the test does.
So to unpack what Dr. Banerjee said is that the IAT measures how quickly or slowly we make mental associations. And mental associations is the process by which we form mental connections between one object or idea to another object or idea. And these connections can be between concepts, ideas, events, or even states of mind, based upon our own specific experiences that take place within the environment in which we live. And what the IAT does is first establish a baseline response time by measuring the speed at which we make mental associations by testing how quickly we're able to categorize simple words and images into two distinct categories. It then takes this initial response time, measured in what is called RT, reaction time, and then proceeds to test the subject with a noticeably harder task. It ups the ante by now making the subject classify possibly unfamiliar words and images, this time into 4 distinct categories. And classifying this new set of words and images might be things or objects that the subject is not used to classifying, which would reveal theoretically a network of mental associations that may not even exist, which would explain why the second task takes so much longer. These then different responses reveal which mental associations we naturally are able to make against those that we find to be much more difficult because of their uncommonness, thereby revealing the degree of our implicit bias. So to recap, what the IAT is measuring is how quickly we make instantaneous judgments based upon the stimuli given, and the speed at which we make these mental associations is used as a marker to determine the amount of implicit bias an individual has. And this test, according to Dr. Banaji and Dr. Greenwald, can be used to test for a whole range of unconscious biases, which includes everything from implicit height preference to implicit racial preference. Now, I want to say this before we move on. I actually do believe that we all possess implicitly held beliefs, or what philosophers would call intuition or moral intuition. My disagreement is not with implicitness, nor is my disagreement with bias. I also believe that it is possible to have implicit or intuitive beliefs that appear on the surface to be correct, but upon further investigation or reflection, turn out to be wrong, turn out to be biased. Nor is my disagreement necessarily with these kind of formal experiments. My disagreement is that the IAT seems to have a fundamental design flaw built into it, based upon a categorical mistake, a type of conceptual confusion that's at the very center of this test. Because whenever philosophers talk about implicit or intuitive beliefs, they mean beliefs that are immediate, which means not mediated through a long train of reflective thinking or thought. When they use that word immediate, they are not referring to the speed at which we make judgments, but only that some things are seen as true without further reflection. And yet, the IAT, per its own inventors, was purposely designed to do just that, to measure speed of judgment captured in reaction time, and then infer from those different reaction times differences in speed of judgment the degree of bias someone has. And I think that's an invalid inference. Speed of judgment is dependent upon so many other factors, such as age, experience, and the very fact that we are all born differently with different cognitive abilities, which would also seem to imply that there is a second hidden assumption baked into the test, which is blank slatism. And even though this test may account for those unknown variables, I still see this as both an invalid test procedure and a non sequitur to infer discriminatory behavior from the results. Now, if you do decide to take the test, which Harvard offers for free, it's called Project Implicit. I have some very bad news for you, because as of right now, the higher your score is, the more biased you are, the more likely you are, according to the test, to discriminate against those outside of your own social group. And once again, here's the shocker. No matter how much you may disagree with the results, according to Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji, they have the evidence and science to back up these claims. Now, what is very revealing about these tests is the glaring racial problem that the Implicit Association Test has supposedly uncovered, which is the revelation that our society has a strong implicit bias towards white preference, meaning a strong implicit bias against black preference. And even more shocking is that even this white preference is shared amongst some black people. Here is Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji in their own words. The automatic white preference expressed on the race IAT is now established as signaling discriminatory behavior. It predicts discriminatory behavior even amongst research participants who earnestly and we believe honestly espouse egalitarian beliefs. That last statement may sound like a self-contradiction, but it's an empirical truth. Among research participants who describe themselves as racially egalitarian, the race IT has been shown reliably and repeatedly to predict discriminatory behavior that was observed in the research. Now, what I'd like everyone to notice is the strength of those statements, the certainty of those statements, and the certainty of their conclusions. Keep those statements in the back of your mind because not only are they claiming that the implicit association test is established science backed by empirical results, but that it has predictive power, predicting discriminatory behavior, both reliably and repeatedly. Those are not only very strong and controversial claims, but claims that appear on the surface as highly counterintuitive. But if the evidence supports their conclusions and the science backs this up, then according to Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji, the IAT is a good indicator of bias towards discrimination, no matter how loudly to the contrary one may protest. Now, before we move on, I need to introduce one more concept from the realm of social psychology that forms the background and is part of the cultural milieu from which the implicit association test gathered its momentum and drew its explanatory power from. And that is the concept known as social priming. And social priming is this idea that subtle stimuli in one's environment can produce a disproportionate influence upon the unconscious mind. And here's the important thing to remember about priming. It's not so much the stimuli itself that matters, as it is the effect that such stimuli has upon our cognition, namely the effect it exerts upon the reservoir of our unconsciousness, those influences that happen unbeknownst to us constantly. And it's precisely this unnoticed effect that intrigues social psychologists because social priming, according to them, affects the mental associations we implicitly and unconsciously form, which in turn affects our behavior in the real world. And it's these cultural and environmental influences that forms the background information from which mental associations are made, which go on to inform the beliefs, decisions, and judgments we make. And it's this concept of social priming and the associations that arise from it that underpins the implicit association test and what it is testing for. And one of the most famous examples of this phenomenon was a study published in 1996 called the Elderly Priming Study by 3 scholars who studied the effects of unconsciously priming volunteers with words that centered around the elderly, which appeared to stimulate behavior within the subjects that can only be described as elderly-like behavior. These social psychologists purposely chose words that carried a significant stereotype attached to them to see if they caused any observable effect upon the participants. These were words such as old, Florida, retired, bingo, wrinkles, conservative, knits, ancient, and so forth and so on. And the kicker was that the participants in this test, who were completely unaware that this word priming was occurring, appeared after exposure to these words to have significantly altered their behavior as they began to move and walk around at a much slower and deliberate pace, and whose actions appeared to mimic elderly characteristics, which, according to these researchers, demonstrated the effect that priming has upon the unconscious mind, and how with just the use of well-placed words, priming can alter behavior significantly. What this experiment showed is not only the reality of social priming, but the significant and almost immediate effects of such priming. Now, to give you a sense of how big these ideas are within the realm of the social sciences and the scientific weight behind them, I turn to none other than the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he states both the evidence and the effects of priming in no uncertain terms. When I describe priming studies to audiences, the reaction is often disbelief. How is it possible for such trivial manipulations of the context to have such large effects? The idea that you should focus on, however, is that disbelief is not an option. The results are not made up, nor are they statistical flukes. you have no choice but to accept that the major conclusions of these studies are true. More important, you must accept that they are true about you. Now, once again, what I'd like you to notice is the language. Those are extremely strong claims from what many consider as a titan in the psychology and behavioral economic profession. Those statements are pronounced with absolute certainty, with the imprimatur of science stamped upon them, and coming no less from the pen of a heavyweight authority figure, a Nobel Prize winner. It's statements like these that demonstrate to the public that these ideas, concepts, and tests coming from the social sciences, and in particular social psychology, are beyond questioning, and that to question these beliefs is to question science itself. Now, to give you a sense of just how big these ideas are and how influential these ideas have become, I put together a sort of short historical survey in 4 short video clips to try to give you an overall sense of the sheer magnitude that these ideas have risen to within our culture. So the first clip goes back to March of 2000 on Dateline NBC when the Implicit Association Test was first introduced into the mainstream.
Good evening. We begin tonight with a question that can touch a nerve. Are you prejudiced? Many people would answer no, but how many people would be willing to take a test to prove it? You're going to get a chance to do that tonight. But first, you'll see 2 groups of people, black and white, take that same scientific test. Some of what they learn surprised them. What will you learn about yourself when you take the test?
You may be saying, not me, I'm not prejudiced. But is it possible that virtually all of us have a hidden racial bias, hidden even from ourselves? That's exactly what this test is designed to uncover. Here's how it works. These words and faces appear rapidly, one after another, around the screen. The test taker is supposed to link each one to the left or right box here in the center, linking positive words like friend to good, negative words like awful to bad, white faces with white, black faces with black. And it's the mistakes that are so revealing.
We all might be prejudiced in ways we're not aware.
Mazarin Banaji of Yale University and Anthony Greenwald of the University of Washington created this test. What do you think this test reveals that perhaps we didn't know before?
How fair are we being when we judge a person?
Here's an additional clip from that same broadcast, just in case you question the scientific basis for the IAT.
In fact, this experiment has passed scientific scrutiny. And the results of the professor's experiments have been published in leading psychological journals.
This test
Our
does say
results
something.
reflect the professor's findings.
Something like 79 or 80% of white Americans who take the test show a preference for white over black.
And here's a second video clip with Dr. Anthony Greenwald, one of the co-creators of the test from April of 2012.
Well, why did you create this test?
Anderson, we were interested in finding a way to tap attitudes and beliefs that people have without being aware of them. Our field of psychology and social psychology has been developing this idea that we operate at an unconscious level much more than we think.
So when people say, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, this test shows otherwise.
Quite a bit otherwise. About 75% of white Americans indicate that they have a stronger association of the racial white with pleasant than racial black with pleasant.
So they associate a white face with pleasant more so than a black face.
Exactly. And this is what we call an implicit attitude preference. It is something very different from what's meant by racism.
So you're not saying that people who do this, who score that way, are racist?
Not at all. And I can't say that strongly enough, because what this test measures is something that is possessed by many people who are quite clearly not racist. They are egalitarian, but they still show this association.
Now, once again, those are very strong claims from Dr. Greenwald, because he is saying, in essence, is that contrary to our best of intentions and contrary to our own consciously held explicit beliefs, racial bias, according to Dr. Greenwald, is endemic because it exists hidden within our unconsciousness and resides there as a consequence of the negative influences of the culture around us. Now, this third video clip is from former FBI Director James Comey in March of 2015.
A second hard truth. Much research points to the widespread existence of unconscious bias. Many people in our white majority culture have unconscious racial biases and react differently to a white face than a black face. In fact, we all, white and black, carry various biases around with us. I am reminded of the song from the Broadway hit Avenue Q, Everyone's a Little Bit Racist, a part of which goes like this. Look around and you will find no one's really colorblind. Maybe it's a fact we all should face. Everyone makes judgments based on race. You should be grateful I did not try to sing that. But if we can't help our latent biases, we can help our behavior in response to those instinctive reactions, which is why we work to design systems and processes to overcome that very human part of us all. Although the research may be unsettling, it is what we do next that matters most.
Now, I am aware that I am beginning to sound like a broken record, but once again, these are bold claims that came from one of the most powerful members of law enforcement. And this goes without saying. These claims, if they are going to be used to justify and alter the makeup of law enforcement, which is to alter the very makeup of our society, must be backed by robust scientific evidence and not simply rhetoric. Now, here's the last video clip, and it's of Hillary Clinton and her take on implicit bias during the 2016 presidential debate on NBC News.
Secretary Clinton, last week you said we've got to do everything possible to improve policing, to go right at implicit bias. Do you believe that police are implicitly biased against black people?
Lester, I think implicit bias is a problem for everyone, not just police. I think, unfortunately, too many of us in our great country jump to conclusions about each other. And therefore, I think we need all of us to be asking hard questions about, why am I feeling this way? But when it comes to policing, since it can have literally fatal consequences, I have said in my first budget, we would put money into that budget to help us deal with implicit bias by retraining a lot of our police officers. I've met with a group of very distinguished, experienced police chiefs a few weeks ago. They admit it's an issue. They've got a lot of concerns. They want support. They want more training. They want more assistance. And I think the federal government could be in a position where we would offer and provide that.
Now, I hope that I was able to show with these various clips just how prevalent this concept and the test associated with it has become. It wouldn't be hyperbole to say that the concept of implicit bias has reached canonical status in the West. And to quote Dr. Anthony Greenwald, we are living according to him and what he calls the implicit revolution. Now, I purposely limited myself to only 4 short video clips, but there is tons of podcasts, lectures, videos, books, journal articles, magazines, newspapers, and almost every major news outlet has done some sort of expose on implicit bias and the Implicit Association Test, all of which has contributed to the popularization and explosion of these ideas. And both Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji have stated in numerous interviews and articles that one of their goals is to fundamentally change the United States legal system by challenging one of the bedrock principles of jurisprudence, the idea of intent. Because the idea behind intentionality is that one is responsible in the eyes of the law for one's own actions. However, this would have to change if this is true, because we would have no control over our unconscious biases. This would change the very landscape of jurisprudence. In addition, both Dr. Banaji and Dr. Greenwald have testified numerous times and have been called to the stand as expert witnesses to speak about the problem of implicit bias when it comes to juror selection, judge sentencing, and the entire legal profession, casting doubt on the very idea of the impartiality of justice. And if you can, do me a favor, go to your favorite search engine and type in TED Talks and implicit bias, and you'll see video after video after video on this topic. There's even a TED Talks video on avoiding the dangers of implicit bias when it comes to programming artificial intelligence. That's just what the world needs. Woke AI running our computers, our games, and our cell phones. What I'm trying to say, or what I'm trying to show, is that this scientific construct of implicit bias has become a juggernaut within our culture. And this may come as a shock to some people, but there even exists an entire industry, a billion-dollar industry. That's right, a billion-dollar industry that has simultaneously grown up around this concept of implicit bias, with firms, businesses, and teams of consultants all dedicated to offering DEI courses, diversity, equity, and inclusion courses and workshops, all offering as part of their packages what is called implicit bias training. And it is almost guaranteed that if you work for almost any big tech company, most Fortune 500 companies, and especially companies like Starbucks, or at any federal, state, or local level of government, then there's a good chance that you've either experienced implicit bias training or know someone who has. And I can almost guarantee you that if you know someone in law enforcement, then chances are that they've attended mandatory training in implicit bias. And if you can, once again, do me another favor. Grab your phone and text someone you know who works for law enforcement or works in law enforcement and ask them if they've ever attended implicit bias training. And tell me what you find out in the comments below. Now, I want to give a little more background information, of which Dr. Banaji and Dr. Greenwald both hinted at earlier when they made their bold predictive claims about the Implicit Association Test, and attempt to flesh out exactly why this concept of implicit bias caught on so quickly and is absolutely ubiquitous in our culture. And that has to do, in my opinion, with the overarching political predisposition that many social scientists possess, which dovetails nicely with their research. And that particular political bias is the ideology of progressivism. And the reason I say this is because both Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji have stated in multiple interviews their attempt to reconcile the fact that overt acts of racism, that is, both direct acts of racism and explicit self-reporting of racism, which according to multiple cultural indicators has been on a noticeable decline since the civil rights era, with what they see as a still existing condition of racial disparity today. I'll say that again. What Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji are attempting to account for is the obvious decline in overt acts of racism, with the profound amount of social economic disparity that still exists amongst minorities today. And the reason why this is all the more baffling to Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji is that there has also been at the same time a rise in egalitarian belief. That is, a rise in the belief that everyone should be treated equally and afforded the same opportunities. And it was precisely this rise in egalitarian belief that was captured in Dr. Greenwald's video clip, as well as their previous quote that both doctors stated that the IAT predicts discriminatory behavior even amongst research participants who earnestly and we believe honestly espouse egalitarian beliefs. That last statement may sound like a self-contradiction, but it's an empirical truth. Among research participants who describe themselves as racially egalitarian, the race IAT has been shown reliably and repeatedly to predict discriminatory behavior that was observed in the research. So here's the thing. How does one explain this cultural disconnect between a great majority of citizens who either espouse or lean egalitarian, and yet if that is the case, how do we account for such societal-wide racial imbalances? Thus enter the perfectly prepackaged progressive gift of the concept of implicit bias and the implicit association test to answer that question. The answer, according to these social psychologists, is implicit bias. It's the missing piece. And this is why what I'm about to say is so important. What these social psychologists have done is to internalize and fetishize racism by using it as a singular explanation for every social ill. And it's not that racism has lessened or become rare, as the statistical evidence clearly shows. It's that racism has been redefined and is still there, except this time it's quietly operating under the surface, hiding unbeknownst to us within our unconscious mind. And that's why there still exists, according to these social psychologists, so much racial discrepancy in our culture. In other words, inequality and social economic disparity is no longer due to explicit racism, but is now a consequence of our hidden implicit racial biases. And I cannot help but ask, What does all of this show? This shows that these social psychologists cannot give up their progressive model of the world, no matter how much evidence they are given to the contrary. They cannot admit any racial progress because their progressive theories about race will not allow them. So they must redefine the meaning of racism to account for what they subjectively see as a continuing problem. Racism for these researchers has to exist behind every door, every nook, and every cranny in society. This also explains why this version of implicit bias can be looked upon as a concept needed to fill a theoretical void, but also a concept in search of a test purposely designed to validate a progressive idea. Now, I need to clarify, I am not saying that racism doesn't exist or that it has somehow magically disappeared. Nor am I saying that there doesn't exist an obvious racial disparity in this country still. But neither am I saying that racism is the singular cause of that disparity or is behind every social ill in our society. You can justifiably believe in the two prior propositions without believing in the latter. And one of the reasons why I made this video was because I have family, I have loved ones, and I have friends who live essentially under third world conditions in modern America. So this is not an abstract thing to me. There are real reasons for why there exists so much social and economic disparity amongst minorities today, but focusing only on one factor to the neglect of all the others not only blinds us, but may actually inhibit a correct diagnosis and only exacerbate the problem. I do not want to see another generation of Native Americans growing up in abject poverty, but solely blaming the white man for all of our problems is not only immoral, but it's easy. It's the low-hanging fruit of an easy, cheap sociological analysis. And it doesn't do anything to solve our problems, but simply gets us off the hook by absolving us from taking responsibility for our own lives. What else does this show about these so-called objective scientists? It shows that they value theory more than evidence, or a better way to say it would be to say that their prior assumptions underdetermine their theory, which goes a long way towards explaining why this movement caught on so quickly, is because it gave academia and those that lean that same direction, politically speaking, a perfectly constructed scientific tool to not only explain racial disparity, but to predict the biases that lead to such disparity. This is why I view this as another cultural Trojan horse of the left, used as a powerful tool to change and shape culture from within by bypassing evidence and rational discussion, all under the banner of scientific proof. Now, all of this can be looked upon as the development of stage one. The next stage is how to ameliorate implicit bias. How do we mitigate or get rid of implicit bias? Thus, the birth of stage two, implicit bias training. Now, I'm going to put on the screen a quote that is from an article published in 1998 in the pages of Psychology Today. And this quote perfectly captures the soon-to-be reigning orthodoxy that the concept of unconscious bias will eventually turn into. Psychologists once believed that only bigoted people use stereotypes. Now, the study of unconscious bias is revealing the unsettling truth. We all use stereotypes all the time without knowing it. We have met the enemy of equality, and the enemy is us. That quote from over 20 years ago perfectly encapsulates the still reigning dominance of implicit bias and the Implicit Association Test, and succinctly answers the question, who is the enemy of equality? We are. And how do we combat this inequality? Well, according to this paradigm, by identifying and rooting out implicit bias. And what better way to achieve that enlightened goal than by entering the public and political realm, thus guaranteeing not only wide application, but wide societal results. This is why this concept and test has grown such powerful political legs. And that's why understanding this scientific construct of implicit bias is so important, not only because it serves a purpose within the realm of politics, but within academia as well. It serves as a type of empirical fortress, or a beachhead, if you will, that many use to ground the claims coming out of the movement known as critical race theory. After all, what better tool is there to prove white supremacy or systemic racism than the Implicit Association Test that not only proves, but predicts hidden unconscious racial bias. And it's exactly this same line of reasoning that is echoed in the writings of Robin DiAngelo, when she says that racial bias is largely unconscious, and that our defensiveness is rooted in the false but widespread belief that racial discrimination can only be intentional. Our lack of understanding about implicit bias leads to aversive racism. What DiAngelo is saying is that white people's defensiveness, what she terms white fragility, is rooted in a naive understanding of racism, which, according to her, can be both explicit and implicit, conscious and unconscious. And it's this concept of implicit bias that forms one of the reasons, according to DiAngelo and other theorists like her, for why they reject a colorblind approach to society. It's not that a colorblind approach is not ideal, it's that it is impossible according to them and their belief system. We cannot get rid of our unconscious biases according to their ideology. That's why understanding this concept of implicit bias is crucial if you want to see and understand how these activists think, especially when this concept is combined with their view of social constructivism and or structural determinism, which brings me to another reason for why this movement caught on so quickly, which a lot of people haven't really touched upon for obvious explosive reasons, but I'll just say it. This test and this concept can both be seen as serving a type of theoretical justification or ethical justification for racism. What I'm saying is that this scientific construct has made it okay for some minorities to mistreat non-minorities and feel justified in doing so. They've been given an elegant theoretical pass because, according to theory, racism can only be structural. It only flows in one direction, from those with power to those without. Therefore, any hurtful words or actions committed by those who don't hold structural power, according to theory, can no longer be labeled as racist because theory says so. Case in point, Ibram X. Kendi, whose own words taken straight from his writings, confirms this. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. According to Kendi's logic, it is not only no longer wrong to discriminate, but one must continue to discriminate because racism no longer exists for those who don't hold power. And my only argument against such thinking is woe unto them who call evil good and good evil, or the old-fashioned saying, two wrongs don't make a right. Now, all of this raises the question, is the implicit association test backed by evidence? Is it based on science or not? Because if it is, then all of my objections go out the window. But if it's not, then this whole thing is one big charade, one big charade. So to answer these questions, let's turn to the next section. Everything that has been said or shown about this concept in this video so far can be boiled down to this. It would not be an overstatement to say that this concept of implicit bias and the implicit association test has been used as a bludgeon for political purposes in our society to achieve things that could not possibly be achieved any other way or morally allowed except under the pretense of science, which brings us to one of the most shocking revelations in modern scientific history, which involves revealing a dirty little secret that most people are completely unaware of, that is called the replication crisis. And the discipline of psychology is at the epicenter of this crisis, and lined up within the crosshairs is none other than the implicit association test, the concept of social priming, and a host of other cherished ideas within the social sciences. It was this event, the replication crisis, that hit the sciences in the early 2010s that I hinted at the beginning of this video, that helped me to finally understand why there was this obvious, profound shift within the literature of implicit bias, and why certain definitions were changing based upon their inability to replicate previous results. It wasn't until I finally put 2 and 2 together that I was able to get a bird's eye view of this topic. Now, to give you an understanding of the gravity of this replication crisis is that it is not only affecting the field of psychology, particularly the field of social psychology, but also the field of economics, especially behavioral economics, and everything from medicine to cancer research, from biology to chemistry, from engineering and to the earth sciences, and the list goes on and on. And just this week, as I was recording this video, an article just came out in Science magazine stating that one of the most cited studies on Alzheimer's disease appears to have had the data purposely manipulated, if not outright fabricated, making it a fraudulent study with millions of dollars wasted and lives ruined because of phony data. So with that being said, what is this thing called the replication crisis? What the replication crisis entails is the inability for researchers to replicate with a high degree of correlation the findings of previously published studies, including the inability to replicate the results of the Implicit Association Test. But it gets worse, much worse, because not only are the results of the IAT proving to be non-replicable, non-repeatable, but the very tools that the IAT uses for psychometric analysis is itself now being called into question because it shows an alarming rate of failed test to retest reliability, which means the IAT is a bogus identifier and predictor of racial bias. Now, why is this important? Why should we be concerned with repeatable results and reliable tests? We should be concerned because science, if it is to mean anything, and apparently it hasn't for the past 2 years, should be based upon repeatable objective results that can be replicated time and time again. Otherwise, we are no longer engaged in science, but in ideology. And to preempt any criticism, I have to say this is not a settled issue. This is not past tense. The replication crisis has not gone away. If anything, it appears to have only gotten worse, as the most recent Alzheimer's scandal shows. I'm going to produce a video series on why I believe the social sciences are so screwed up. It's a work in progress, but just as a tease, I believe that the social sciences have adopted the entirely wrong methodology for over a century now and have so completely and thoroughly bought into a scientific method that only belongs to physics, to the physical sciences, that they can no longer see why their tests keep bearing such rotten fruit, as they continue to fuss and squabble over such minor things as p-value and statistical significance, completely missing the bigger picture, which is that their replication problem is a direct consequence of the narrow and misguided parameters of instrumentalism, positivism, and pragmatism. I'll just say this in passing. If you think talking to the woke is likely to get you canceled, you ain't seen nothing yet. Imagine telling an entire profession of social scientists that the method that they are using to study human beings is wrong. You want to see real weeping and gnashing of teeth? More to come on this. Now, before I go further into the replication crisis, I want to highlight something that is extremely shocking and extremely revealing. And I don't think enough people are aware of this very telling episode in the history of modern science. And for this, I need to go back to the year 2012 when Daniel Kahneman, the same Nobel Prize winning laureate, the same author who I quoted from earlier, sent off an internal email to a group of colleagues and warned them that a methodological storm was on the horizon and that it was their responsibility to rectify it. Here's an excerpt from that letter from Professor Kahneman. As all of you know, of course, questions have been raised about the robustness of priming results. The storm of doubts is fed by several sources, including the recent exposure of fraudulent researchers and general concerns with replicability that affect many disciplines. For all these reasons, right or wrong, your field is now the poster child for doubts about the integrity of psychological research. Your problem is not with the few people who have actively challenged the validity of some priming results. It is with a much larger population of colleagues who in the past accepted your surprising results as facts when they were published. These people have now attached a question mark to the field, and it is your responsibility to remove it. My reason for writing this letter is that I see a train wreck looming. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the same man who just wrote 1 year earlier in his book about priming that disbelief is not an option and that the results are not made up nor statistical flukes, and that you have no choice but to accept that the major conclusions of these studies are true. And more important, you must accept that they are true about you. Now, I have to give Dr. Kahneman kudos for facing these problems head on, but the degree of absolute moral certitude that these dubious ideas were presented to the public, coupled with what I can only describe as the condescending nature of his original remarks, I find to be not only extremely offensive, but also very revealing. because it's this tone, this hubris, that to me is a symptom of a much greater and catastrophic problem within the social sciences, which I believe is directly proportional to a wrong methodology, a lack of intellectual diversity, which seriously hinders their ability to remain objective. And the reason I say this is because without pushback or feedback, it's easy to remain oblivious inside an echo chamber of like-minded colleagues who all think, reason, and vote the same way about social and political issues. Now, this replication crisis was and is so bad that Nature in 2016 asked 1,576 scientists if they think there is a reproducibility crisis in science, and over 70% of those surveyed said yes, there is a crisis of reproducing the results from a previously published study. In other words, many of the conclusions that were drawn from these studies involving statistical data were not only proving impossible to reproduce, but some of them produced the opposite intended effects from the previous study. And in 2015, there was a famous Science article that revealed an open collaboration in which teams of scientists attempted to replicate 100 studies that had already been published in some of the most prestigious scientific journals, and they were only able to replicate 39 out of 100 of them. And what I'd like you to pay attention to is that graph on the right side of the screen from this open collab. On the x-axis, you have the original effect size, the original published papers, the original data set. And on the y-axis, you have the replication effect size. That's this new team of researchers attempting to reproduce the previous studies. And that diagonal line, that represents the replication effect size compared to the original. And if there were no hiccups and everything went according to plan, you'd see a good distribution of plot points close to or around that diagonal line. But what I want you to notice is that a relatively high degree of these studies approaches either close to zero or on the other side of zero, which means that some of these studies not only failed to replicate, but actually produced the opposite effect. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not only shocking, but disturbing. In layman terms, this means that the overwhelming majority of these counterintuitive claims, ideas, and concepts that came from the discipline of social psychology and were plastered all over the media for the past 20 years and rammed down the public's throat, all under the patina of established science, have either been nullified or the statistical evidence to support the original claims is so scant as to be irrelevant. That, ladies and gentlemen, once again, is not science, but ideology. And not only did the social priming study, the elderly study that I mentioned earlier, also fail to be replicated on multiple occasions, but now the very tool that underlay the so-called implicit revolution has also come under scrutiny. And for that, we now turn to what I like to refer to as the smoking gun of the Implicit Association Test. This is an excerpt from a paper published in 2015 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology from Dr. Greenwald, Dr. Banaji, and Dr. Nozick. Under the heading, Identifying Likely Perpetrators of Discrimination, they say this about the Implicit Association Test, the very test they invented. IAT measures have two properties that render them problematic to use to classify persons as likely to engage in discrimination. Therefore, attempts to diagnostically use such measures for individuals risk undesirably high rates of erroneous classification. Did you catch that? Everything that has been said about this test for the past 20 years and has been used to identify and predict discriminatory behavior, now according to its own inventors, in a small blurb, which very few people will ever come across or read, that the IAT has no predictive power and therefore no diagnostic use. Even worse is the implications of this. This means that the people who have been put through mandatory implicit bias training and classified as exhibiting a tendency towards discriminatory behavior or harboring hidden racial bias because of the IAT and subjected to implicit reprogramming, social behavior modification, have actually been misdiagnosed by a faulty diagnostic test. I don't know what you think, but to me, that sounds like psychological abuse and very fertile ground for legal action. It appears that these social scientists got way ahead of the science and made claims that were not backed up by the evidence. And it seems to me, in my humble opinion, that these social psychologists and their obvious political bias, the media's obvious political bias, and the political bias of progressive politicians was the one thing that was constantly operating silently and implicitly in the background rather than the science. And here's why this whole thing bothers me, and hopefully you as well, is that you won't see this kind of balanced and cautious statement, which looks almost like a retraction from Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji on any of the same institutions and media figures that push this test for 20 plus years now. And if you do see this mentioned at all, it will only be in passing. It will never be presented to the same degree as it was celebrated for over 20 years now. Now, as I bring this video to a close, I think there are so many lessons we can learn from this, and I hope that what I've covered should, in the very least, temper the person who blindly says, just follow the science, and should hopefully cause some sort of epistemic humility that recognizes that our knowledge is provisional, incomplete, and prone to error, and that science, if it is to work correctly, needs intellectual diversity, transparency, honesty, and an openness to evidence that challenges the status quo. Which brings me to this. The moment science changes from an open mode of inquiry to an authoritarian model that you are no longer allowed to question, and is being driven more by an irrational allegiance to one's particular political ideology or one's own political tribe rather than the truth, then you are no longer engaged in science, but instead you are engaged in propaganda. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you in the next video.